Millennial pause. We are recording. Hi everyone, it's Monday, January the 26th, 2026. And obviously the university's closed because there's been a big snowstorm. Now this means that we lose our first meeting of the grad section for having and being. And given that there are so few of those and that the ones we have are so short, I didn't want to cause that to lose any time. So while I would have liked to have done a live summary of building and interpreting possession sentences, um, I don't want to postpone the week where we read chapter 8 of that book any further so that we can get a move on. So this is the substitute. I'm going to record a video of me summarizing the book and post it to YouTube, and then post a YouTube link to you, and then in the Discord we can discuss it. Um, yeah, so without further ado, I'll share my screen, and I'll show you very, very briefly, as briefly as I can, what this book was about, basically. Well, let me just see if I can get this to go full screen without too much of a bother. Okay, we've got the beach ball. Nope, didn't want to do that. Let's try a different way. Okay, that's promising. I'm screen sharing. Put my head out of the way. Now it's right in the middle of the screen. That's no good. Move. Get out of your way. Get out of the way, me. All right. So here we go. Um, this is an extremely well studied topic. And more or less every point of view that you could imagine taking on it had been taken at some point in some form. And so I think all there is to really do is, and this was true when I was writing the book, is figure out the right combination of ideas and the right implementation of existing ideas. And the literature, when you look at it, revolves around two puzzles. So the puzzles are very old. The names that I gave them were new when I gave them to them. And some people have found this framing useful since then, but it really is just a framing, not a discovery of mine. These are the two puzzles. The puzzles are one that I call the too many surface structures puzzle, and another that I call the too many meanings puzzle. The too many surface structures puzzle is illustrated by these five examples that you've got on screen right now. So I have a book which morphosyntactically looks like a transitive clause. Okay. Number two is from Isi Cosa Dinentwadi, which is literally I am with book. And it's a translational equivalent of one. Umenya jest kniga is Russian, more literally, that's in three. At me is there is a book. Nekim van Kuniven is Hungarian. This is like me dative, there is a book. Where the dative marked the dative marking here is one of the markings that possessors can have in Hungarian. And you've also got the first person singular possessed form of the noun. So this looks kind of literally like there is a book of mine, or like my book exists, if you like, with the my and the books split up somehow by movement in Anna Sabolchi's account, and by resumption and binding in a later account by Marcel Den Dicken. And number five illustrates yet a different option. So this says Nogachta Libro Tiapuan or Nogachta Libroi Tiapuan. The agreement there is optional. But this is literally, there is a book for me almost, because the possessor here is genitive marked, but it's being resumed on the verb by this little object marker here. And there's an applicative suffix here. So syntactically, the possessor here is an applied argument introduced by an applicative suffix, which is once again on an existential be verb. So there is a book for me. So the puzzle here is that, okay, these are all translational equivalents of each other. They can all be used to talk about ownership of a book on the part of the speaker. um, but they look like they have wildly different argument structures, and that's a challenge to any theory that wants to maintain a relatively tight relationship between argument structure, syntactic argument structure, and semantics. Right. The other big puzzle in this domain is one that I call the too many meanings puzzle. So consider six. John has a PlayStation 3. John has a sister. John has blue eyes. This table has four sturdy legs. John has a cold. John has a great deal of resilience. Um, these cover ownership, kinship, body part terms, part whole relationships, diseases, attributes, and you can go on and on and on. There are loads of different ways in which you can use have. Um, the The point is that having a PlayStation 3 and having a sister and having a cold and all of these don't seem to have a huge amount to do with each other. And yet the fact that they're marked with the same verb is not a quirk of English. Um, you can find lots and lots of languages where all these um, same constructions use the same, um, or rather, all of these same meanings are marked by the same construction. Languages do vary somewhat, so some of them have more than one construction, which sort of carves up these domains in a different way. But even those languages don't help very much because they often still carve things up in a way that's kind of conceptually sort of odd seeming. So take Icelandic, for example, right? So Icelandic has a verb which is used, it's eiga, which is it's a transitive verb and it's used for ownership and kinship, but for none of the others, right? And then for the others, those are all carved up between another have verb, which is hava, which is the cognate of have in English, and a construction which looks more like the Ishikawa construction, which is be with, right? Um, so you can have in different languages different ways of carving these up, but they're often still carved up in ways that give rise to a different version of the same too many meanings puzzle. So the too many meanings puzzle says, how is it that one construction, apparently one construction, right? That's kind of the question whether it is one and the same thing, can have so many meanings. Um, and the big claim in the book is that you can solve both of these puzzles very, very simply by doing the following. So 7a, take thematic roles out of syntax, have them simply be parts of the meanings of heads in the thematic domain. So another way of putting this is that there are no theta roles in the sense of syntactic features assigned to arguments. All there are thematic relations, and which are relationships between individuals and eventualities, and between eventualities and other eventualities, and all of those are mediated as part of formal semantics, the semantic component of the language faculty, right? Not in syntax. Um, and 7b, allow heads to vary within and across languages with respect to whether they take a specifier or not. Now, neither of these two ideas are new, or were new at the time I wrote the book and the 2014 dissertation that the book grew out of. So 7a is present already in Hyman Kratz's textbook and a lot of subsequent literature. In the context of the minimalist program, 7a is one of the major ways of doing away with the theta criterion as a separate sort of part of the theory. 7b is a staple of much modern comparative syntax literature. So the idea that one and the same functional head can vary across languages with respect to whether it requires a specifier or allows a specifier or only optionally has one. That's part of the explanation for what's for what differentiates null subject from non-null subject languages. What differentiates V2 from non-V2 languages. So part of the V2 parameter is whether spec-CP requires a specifier in all circumstances, right? So 7a and 7b don't represent theoretical novelties. My contribution was showing that these alone suffice to solve the puzzles in section 1. In particular, in combination with the subclaims in 8, many of which had been argued for independently as well, right? So here are the subclaims. 8a, possession is fundamentally a relationship between two DPs, the possessor and the possessee, right? So my and book in my book, right? And I and a book in I have a book, right? Um, now, because the relation that is contributed by the possessee comes from some noun phrase structure, right? Um, if you want to build propositions that concern such relations, you're going to need to bring a verb into the picture because things like tense, aspect, and clause type are all features of the extended projection of the verb and not of the noun. So if you want to say sentences about possession relationships, you're going to need to bring a verb in somewhere, a dummy verb, ideally, one that will simply transmit the semantic contribution of the possessee up the tree, and that's what a copula is. So 8c, copulas exist to sentensify fundamentally non-sentency meaning. So it happens that universal grammar provides for a number of different predicate types, syntactic categories of predicate, like adjective phrases, noun phrases, and so on. And to link those to clause typing and other things that are part of the extended projection of the verb, you need a kind of dummy verb, and that's what copulas are. D, the copula is realized as have, as a transitive verb and otherwise, if the rest of the structure is transitive, and it will be realized to be otherwise. So this is the claim that have and be are two sides of the same coin, here cashed out in a very specific way, namely in terms of whatever it is in your theory that makes a structure transitive. That's the difference between have and be. And this was a position that existed in the literature before my book and before my dissertation, but it was a minority position. The majority position within the generative literature always involves saying that have was the result of incorporating a preposition from somewhere underneath the be verb, lower in the structure of the be verb into be. My suggestion, along with Toyn Hoekstra, was that actually the relevant bit of extra structure is above be, and it's the same bit of structure that makes a structure transitive in the morphosyntactic sense of introducing an external argument and licensing a DP in the complement domain at the same time. Right. Hoekstra had already had this idea implemented in a different way from how I end up implementing it. And then we've got AE, which is a substantive novelty here. So you get two subclaims here. One, possession constructions can vary in the place in the structure where the possessor is introduced, right? And two, the different ways of building possession sentences entailed by Roman numeral one here could have somewhat different, albeit overlapping meanings, depending on the semantic contribution of the pieces that made them up. So again, A through D had appeared in many guises in earlier literature. My contributions here were to show how putting A through D together allows you to make good on the big claim in my 7, and then also to give existence proofs for the claims in AE. So big chunks of the book are devoted to showing you that it's a correct prediction. The languages really can vary in terms of where the possessor is first merged in a possession sentence, and that indeed sometimes the other bits of structure that are involved in putting these things together are not semantically innocent, and so you can have cross-linguistic variation, for example, in the sorts of possessive meanings that a be with construction can render. And that turns out to be true. And that part especially is a big problem for the strongest version of what before my book was the standard view of these things, which was that you solve the too many surface structures puzzle by having a single underlying structure from which all of the others are derived, like via movement and other things. If some of these constructions vary in their meaning, then that can't be true in general, right? And so that ended up being important. Okay, so how exactly do you end up making good on the big claims in 7 via the subclaims in 8? Here's how in outline, okay? So section 3 of the handout is called Solving the Too Many Meanings Puzzle. So 2 ideas about how possession relations are introduced semantically into a structure. It's stuff inside of DP. Okay, so alienable possession relations, which is a loose use of terminology there. So alienable versus inalienable is a morphosyntactic distinction. Here, what I'm saying is the sorts of semantic relationship which are prototypically associated with alienable morphosyntax. Okay, those are introduced by a special functional head inside DP called POS after Barker 1995. Those relationships which are prototypically related to inalienable morphosyntax. So things like part-whole relations, body-part relations, and kinship relations, this sort of thing, are introduced by the noun itself, right? And the type of relation depends on the meaning of the noun. This is a fairly sort of commonplace idea. So here we start seeing trees decorated with lambdas. I'm not going to talk too much about the actual lambdas here if you're a non-native speaker of lambdas. Um, and then I can try and help you with that as we go forward. If you already know a bit about lambdas, then you can scrutinize these in your own time and then maybe ask me questions about them in the Discord. But to just talk briefly through what we're seeing here, the idea is that book is a predicate. So it says, okay, give me an individual and I'll tell you whether it's a book or not. True if it's a book, false if it's not a book, right? Now that's the type of meaning that can't combine with the possessor directly, right? It's not a relationship, it's just a predicate, right? And so in order to make a possessed noun phrase or a possessed anything out of book, you need to combine it with something which carries that relational meaning, and that's what POS does, right? So this takes a predicate and then says there are two individuals and an eventuality such that book is true of the second individual, and there's a state of possession that exists between the two individuals, right? So that's what POS does, and so John's book ends up being meaning, through various fancy footwork, the individual such that there is a state, and the book, the individual is a book, and it belongs to John, right? That's what John's book means. And then for an inalienable possession relation, speaking loosely, the idea would be that the noun beard as part of its meaning means, it's a body part of somebody, right? And so that means that the possession relationship is already there in the noun, and so you don't need POS to give it to you, and that's how you get John's beard, right? Now, as I said, these relations are introduced associated with different bits of noun phrase structure. We need to bring a verb into the picture if we want to make a proposition about such a relation. And it turns out the claim is that there are a variety of ways in which natural language can do this, but all of them will in principle work just as well, regardless of where inside of the DP the relation was introduced. So we've already solved the too many meanings puzzle. So the idea is that, body part relations, ownership relations, kinship relations, they're not semantically a natural class at all, right? But they are syntactically a natural class. They're all associated with different bits of DP structure, right? Given that they're associated with different bits of DP structure, you can embed a DP structure underneath one of these dummy verbs. And the idea is that you'll just transmit the relevant relation of the tree, right? So the reason why one and the same structure can have all these different meanings is actually answered by saying presupposition failure. Actually, there's different structures inside of the DP, and what they have in common is that they're all embeddable under one of these copular verbs, and so they can be transmitted. So that's a solution. That's it. We've done it, right? So here is the solution summarized in my 12. If I can get it to stay on the screen and move my face out of the way. So possession constructions can mean so many things because they involve intensifying a meaning that comes from inside DP. There are many subtypes of such meaning, so it's not a semantic natural class. These meanings pattern together because they are a syntactic natural class. They come from inside DP. Okay. And obviously, this is a very high level, very abstract discussion of how it works. The book goes, I can't remember exactly how many pages it is. It's something in the order of like 350 or 400. Most of it is filling the details out. Okay. Now, what about the too many surface structures puzzle? What are some ways that the possessor can be introduced? So a common way is simply to build a possessed DP and combine it with an existential copula. So 13 is a very schematic sort of view on what that might look like, right? So here we've got book. We make it into something that denotes a possession relation with this POS head. We combine that with a DP here that denotes the speaker. And then what we've got here is an open function, right? A relation between an individual and eventuality, such that the individual is a book and the eventuality is a possession state, right? That holds between the book and the speaker. And the idea is that You can take this and embed it under an existential, and then you'll get a sentence which means there is an individual, such that the individual is a book. Um, and ultimately, once you've linked everything to tense and everything, it will be, there is a state, it's a possession state, and there's a book. It's a sorry, there is an individual, it's a book, and it belongs to the speaker, right? So this is what Hungarian does, right? So the idea here is that you've introduced the possessor thematic relation in the semantics using POS, and then you've satiated that immediately by putting a DP in the specifier of POS. Um, because of that, I refer to this situation, sorry, this situation as instant gratification. Um, and Hungarian looks like a language that does this. So here's the Hungarian example repeated. Um, so given that you've got I dative, there is book here. So the copula intervenes between the possessor and the possessee. That means that something must have happened to split the two things up, and that's what Anna Sabocci argues is going on here. But regardless um, of whether Sabocci was right about that, or whether Dendickin is right in arguing that instead what you've got is a silent pronoun inside of um, the possessed noun phrase with the dative generated outside of that and binding it. Either way, this construction will involve merging something in spec pos p and instantly gratifying that semantic requirement for a possessor. Now, that's how Hungarian does it, but given 7b above, other languages might allow or even require POS to lack a specifier. So suppose we're in a language that allows that at least as an option. Then we can build a structure which includes the POS head, but doesn't have a specifier for that POS head. So that will give you a structure that looks like 15. And that will give you a POSP that still denotes, a relationship between two individuals and an eventuality, right? And you can imagine like that becoming the denotation of the whole noun phrase, right? If you embed such a noun phrase that still denotes an open relation in some kind of copula construction, and any kind will do, so long as the semantics comes together successfully, you can introduce the possessor somewhere higher up, and you'll get a possession sentence, something with the exact same truth conditions as the Hungarian case that we just saw, but with a very different syntax. And then the possessor role will be satiated under what I call in the book delayed gratification. So basically, you've got something like POS here that introduces a certain thematic relationship, a requirement, a semantic requirement for a possessor argument, but the DP, whose denotatum ultimately saturates that argument slot, isn't introduced immediately. It's introduced higher up in the tree. So that's why it's called delayed gratification. Mechanisms very like delayed gratification had been a staple of LFG and HBSG and other frameworks in their analyses of raising and control constructions. Within minimalism, this work by Jim Wood and chapters 3 to 5 of my book argue that we need delayed gratification and we need it to be independent from raising and control. So raising and control have to involve different things in delayed gratification. The reason is that raising and control in the traditional mainstream generative grammar analyses involve an actually syntactically represented argument in the lower part of the structure. So in the classic account of raising, that's a trace of the moved item. In the classic account of control, it's big pro. Delayed gratification is different because under the delayed gratification, there is no there is no syntactically represented item in the lower position. So there's no big pro in spec pos p, there's no trace in spec pos p under this idea, right? There's just nothing, and that's different and makes different predictions. Predictions that we argue are right. So anyway, back to the main point here, which is that in principle, universal grammar ought to permit you to introduce a specifier um, higher up, and there are various ways in which it could do that. I say specifier, I mean the semantic thing that's going to end up being a semantic argument. You don't actually have to introduce it in a specifier, as we'll see immediately. One way in which that might happen is we could take 15, embed it under an existential copula, and then introduce the possessor in a locked-in prepositional phrase adjoined to the verb phrase. And the idea was that this will give you Russian. So um, 16 is the tree for this. As you can, what you can see here is different is that POSP has no specifier, so the relation gets passed up the tree. The existential bit of the meaning does something special to it here, and then you end up introducing the possessor itself in this prepositional phrase up here, which means at me. And the meaning that you get at the end, if you compare the denotation of this verb phrase with the denotation of the one upstairs, it's exactly the same, right? So Hungarian and Russian end up with identical LFs, identical logical formulae from different syntaxes. And that's the crucial thing, right? Finally, you can imagine delaying gratification until the highest position in the thematic domain, what Kratzer calls voice P. If you delay it that long, you will end up with a fully a transitive, a morphosyntactically transitive configuration, right? And that's what have is, right? So the idea is in languages like English, you can build the DP back in 15 that ends up denoting a relation. VB denotes an identity function, so it just passes that up the tree. Voice has a variety of denotations that it can take. It has a variety of allocemes, but the main substantive allocemes that it takes, it can only take if its complement is a predicate of eventualities, and that's not what this denotes here, right? This here is it takes three arguments, not just one. So that means that voice is forced to take its expletive alloceme. That pushes the possession relation higher up the tree. John goes in as the possessor, and then you end up with existential closure over this open variable, and that gives you a denotation which is identical to the denotation that you end up with for Hungarian and Russian, right? So in this way, different syntaxes can end up with truth conditionally identical meanings. And this will give you a have structure. So this here is a transitive voice. So it introduces a external argument in a specifier as a bundle of five features with which it licenses this DP downstairs. That's what transitivity is in this theory. And then the idea is that have is what B looks like when it's in a transitive context, right? And B is what B looks like otherwise. That's what 19 says. Um, and that's it, right? So the solution to the too many surface structures puzzle is that given that you've taken thematic rules out of syntax and that independently the functional heads are able to vary across languages in terms of whether they allow, require, or forbid a specifier, you automatically predict this sort of variation to be possible. And the reason why all these different structures can have the same meaning is that the different ways in which you're introducing the possessor into the structure are having no impact on the meaning because B is itself essentially meaningless. It makes no contribution to the at least the thematic relations in the clause, and the basic meaninglessness of B is a commonly assumed idea. And it also, the book argues, allows this without opening the door to chaos in other areas of argument structure. So part of the puzzle here is that outside of possession relationships, there seems to be very, very strong linking regularities, right? Regularities about how agents and themes map to syntactic structures, for example, which are very robust. We still keep those. We keep those because the thematic domain has a relatively rigid universal structure where the head associated with agent roles is higher up than wherever theme roles come from, right? And other verbs, unlike B, are semantically substantive, so they impose restrictions on the semantic nature of the arguments that surround them, which mean that delayed gratification can't run riot in the way that it does with B, because B imposes no such restrictions, and that's why possession sentences look so weird and wonderful in the variation, right? It's basically all because of the meaninglessness of B, um, which in itself is also a key part of the solution to the too many meanings puzzle, right? So the too many meanings puzzle is solved by the idea that there are lots of different things that you can have in DP with unsurprisingly different meanings, but all those meanings, by virtue of being introduced by things that are in DP, are transmissible up the tree, right? Um, um, by by a copular verb, which of course you can just combine it with. Right. So that's it. That's the book. And the rest of it is the details. So what I'm going to do with this video now is I'm going to post it to YouTube, and you have access to the handout already. I'll repost it in the Discord, and you can ask me questions about this there. And in the meantime, be reading chapter 8 of Building and Interpreting Possession Sentences, the final chapter where I talk about all the things that I failed at. And we will hopefully be able to convene in person next Monday to talk about that. Till then, see you.